Always delighted to be with you on the airways and those who are joining via the World Wide Web. We trust that your marriages are doing well, and like we like to say here at Marriage Encounter, if your marriages aren't doing so well, you have tuned in to the right place, because we're going to be sharing some insightful hints, ideas, tips, suggestions as to how you can work towards getting your marriage to where it ought to be by the grace of God. With me, Dr. Greene, is Dr. Mark Braithwaite. We're delighted to have you. Welcome, Dr. Braithwaite.
Thanks, Dr. Greene, and a pleasure to be on the airwaves with you. We are grateful for this wonderful opportunity once again to share with you on Marriage Encounter. We've been having some very exciting discussions, Doc, and we hope to continue that today. And trust that you, of course, will reach out to somebody, remind them that Marriage Encounter is on. Call your spouse, call a friend, let them know Marriage Encounter is on, and let's share together today.
Well, we want to begin with a word of prayer, so we invite you to bow your heads with us. Eternal Father and our God, thank you for the opportunity and privilege to share with our friends all around the world, because some are listening via the World Wide Web. We pray that you will grant understanding as we share these important principles today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
We have been discussing values, and we are talking about the value of honesty. What an important value to have in your relationship. If you are not honest, your marriage is in trouble. And we shared quite a bit on this, Doc, but we did say that there are some areas that provide a challenge, some areas that individuals find it a little difficult to be honest about. Last week, I believe we spoke about feelings, your true feelings, disappointments. We spoke about areas dealing with desires and likes and dislikes, hurts, and even anger and hatred. We want to start today by talking about one of those real serious areas. That's sex. There are many dimensions to this, but I think people readily think about, oh boy, I had an affair.
Right. Well, and that in itself is quite interesting. When we talk about honesty, we're, again, just to reiterate, we're talking about the willingness of somebody to be vulnerable about their feelings and about exactly what's going on. But in the context of thinking about sex and sexuality and honesty, you could also be discussing our likes and our dislikes, satisfaction, and not just physically, but also emotionally as well. How satisfying was your sexual experience in the context of your overall marital experience? Was it gratifying? Some people would say at the end of maybe a sexual experience, they may have felt, a bit used. Some people may say they may feel as though it wasn't gratifying to them. They may feel as though only one person really enjoyed the encounter. So, outside of what you shared earlier in terms of honesty about if a person may have had an affair and gone outside of the marriage, we have those other dimensions also.
So you're saying, Doc, that there is this sexual encounter, and one spouse asks the other, "Did you enjoy it?"
Right.
And deep down inside, they didn't really enjoy it.
Correct.
They didn't think it was one of the more fulfilling experiences. But they feel if they're honest, the spouse may get hurt.
That's right.
So
That's right.
rather than speaking the truth. And that is why this becomes a challenge, because sometimes you have fears. That's something we're going to talk about, maybe not today, but perhaps next week.
Yes.
Sometimes you may have fears, and you may be thinking, if I am honest, my spouse may be disappointed, may begin to become depressed. And so let me just say that I had a good time.
Right. Well, and that leads back to what we discussed last week and probably the week before about the whole context of deception. Because what you're actually doing is pretending to have enjoyed something that you actually did not. So you're really deceiving the person into thinking that everything is okay when it's really not okay.
Well, I attended a seminar at one time. We had multiple presenters. I was presenting, but there was another person who was presenting, and this particular individual was presenting on sex. And the individual said, some of you fake orgasms.
Right.
Now,
right.
we're talking about honesty here.
Honesty, yes.
And that's interesting. So this is a pretensive move to suggest that you're having such a great time when indeed you're not.
Right. Right.
So that's been dishonest.
Yeah, and the reality is the only way to really address those concerns is really to confront it, to speak about it, to work towards a resolution if there's a challenge going on. I mean, we in my experience of pre and post marital counseling, I would often hear some persons indicate that, during their experience or after maybe a sexual experience, and this is particularly for women, they would end up crying, because they felt, in some cases used, they felt like, they were unable emotionally to connect to their spouse, etc., etc. And well, we've discussed some of the rudiments of sex and sexuality because we understand that women are far more emotional beings. Of course, men are a little more practical, and a man, even though he may have emotional discomfort, can have a sexual experience and feel pretty gratified, while a woman would not. But in the context of our discussion, Doc, we're talking about honesty, and we're saying that a woman or a man should be able to say to their spouse, this wasn't exciting for me, or it has not been exciting for me for a while, or I'm having some challenges here.
I think generally, we have shared before, Doc, that the whole matter of talking in the first instance about sex, discussing your sexual encounter with your spouse is an important exercise.
Yes, yes.
And now we are adding the dimension of being honest about it. Because, if you are not honest, then you are withholding very important information from your spouse.
Very true.
Now,
Yeah.
when your spouse asks, did you enjoy this experience? And you said, oh, yes, it was great. When deep down it wasn't, you could suffer serious consequences.
Yes, absolutely.
Because...
Right. Well, I mean, not to cut you, but just to suggest that if your spouse thinks that it's good, it's great, then that's how it will continue. Right. And you will remain in that cycle for months, weeks, months, years to come, decades.
That's correct.
Which would be very sad.
And that's the point I was making, that it could be very consequential.
Yeah.
So the matter of being honest is important. And we are highlighting this as one area that some people are challenged by, in terms of opening up and sharing that, this is where I am.
Just before you go ahead, Doc, while we're discussing honesty and the importance of being honest, and maybe not going into the deep rudiments, I just want to highlight the fact that there may be persons, because of their upbringing, who have a very difficult time talking about sex. Because for whatever reason, they may have grown up in an environment where sex was discussed as it was nasty. I remember you shared the story of a particular lady who says, when you mention that word in church, she gets upset with you. Otherwise, she's your good friend, but when you mention the word sex in church, it's a problem. And so I'm saying that there may be persons who have, realities that have caused them to have a difficult time being open and being able to really talk about the sexual experience. Maybe they feel it's wrong to talk about it. Maybe it's just very uncomfortable. And so in those cases, I think, maybe sometimes some additional help may be necessary. But in order to get to that place, there must be honesty. There must be honesty.
That's very true. Now, another area of discomfort for some people with being honest is the matter of sins, challenges that they may have had in their lives, experiences where they may have done something wrong deliberately. Maybe they had a past. They have even perhaps asked God to forgive them and have changed their lives, but somehow they find it difficult to come clean with their spouse about that.
Right. Yeah. So again, we spoke earlier about the whole context of the ability to be vulnerable and to share with your spouse exactly what's going on with you, maybe for fear of being judged, maybe for fear that your spouse may get upset with you as well and say, why didn't you tell me this before, etc., etc. But again, honesty is really, as we say locally, is the best policy. Being able to share. We do well. I see you're going to make a point, so go ahead.
I wanted to jump in here with this.
Yes.
Because when we're talking about sins and past behaviors,
right.
I want to go back there before we come in the present. if you did things in your past before you got married, a good time to talk about those is before you get married.
Before you get married, yeah.
During
yeah.
courtship, find a good time.
Right.
Because let's say that here was a young lady who had an abortion, right? And this can be a very painful exercise, experience. And she has not told anybody about it. Now she is getting married. And she wonders, should I share this information with my fiance or not? If I do, maybe he might,
Think, yeah.
And eventually she decides not to,
Right.
right? So she has kept it hidden from him. But now that she's married, it is haunting her. It is a lot more challenging to address it after you're married than before you're married.
Yeah.
I just thought I would say.
No, it's absolutely correct. And, the reality is that those situations, circumstances, things in the past that have that significant potential to come back and haunt you are things that you really may want to speak about. You could have a situation where, in the case of maybe an abortion, just using that as an example, where later in life you have to do your medical checks and so forth and so on, and maybe based on some maybe scar or something, your doctor might say, well, you've had an abortion before, and imagine if your husband is there at the time, how does that, how do you address that? How do you speak to that, medical history, definitely has a way sometimes of coming back up in your future life. And so, as I said, there are things that it's really better to be honest upfront about. Let the person make a choice, let them make a decision. I think it's the best thing that you can do, really, to give the person an opportunity to decide, what they want to do with that information.
And as we talk about values, the significance of building your marriage on a solid foundation. And this is where values come in. So when we talk about commitment to God, when we talk about love, and now we're talking about honesty, so during courtship, for those of you who are listening and are not yet married, several persons have said to me, I'm not married yet, but I'm listening and I'm getting useful information. So this is a great thing to consider. Have some important values that you are building your relationship on. And so before you say I do, it is important to say, if I am going to be very honest, then I'm going to share anything that may impact my life after marriage. I need to get it out there. It's better my spouse know who they're getting married to than to wake up. Because, that example you use there, Doc, can be a really traumatic experience.
Exactly.
You visit the doctor with your spouse after being married for 6 years, 7 years, and now you're discovering that your spouse had an abortion. That's serious. That's serious.
And,
Let's just put it there.
It's amazing because, sometimes persons think that, this wouldn't affect me down the road. Honesty is really critical. And I was going to make the point, Pastor, that, when you are dating, we have a tendency, persons have a tendency to avoid certain subjects, right? Because they don't want to mess things up. They feel like the courtship is going well, the relationship is going well, and they don't want to introduce anything significant or severe that they may lose this person in their life. And I think, it's really critical to avoid that notion and that thinking, and really to discuss every and anything that you can discuss before you get married, because they're going to come up. It's going to come up at some point in your relationship. I have a very extreme example, but it has happened in the past where a man may have chosen to have a vasectomy. He doesn't want to have any children, and he doesn't tell his fiancée that. And I mean, again, it's deceptive, because maybe in the discussion she says, well, I would like to have at least one child, and he's like, oh yeah, I would like to have one child too, knowing very well, Doc, that he cannot have any children. And that deception coming out, you go in your marriage now, you can't have any children, and then she's saying, well, let's go and do something. You're reluctant, you don't want to go. Of course you don't want to go, because you've had a vasectomy. And then there's a point where it comes to, and he has to now come out and say, well, I had a vasectomy. I mean, how devastating, how deceptive is that?
Very. That's as much as I can say on that. And I wanted to come in with this point, Doc, that it is so important. If we have to do all of these things before marriage, that you take your time. So you can't propose to your spouse, your fiance, on the 15th to get married on the 20th.
Correct.
You know, and stranger things than these have happened.
Yeah.
You know, and so we want to emphasize the importance of having good marital preparation. Now, we do probe these areas, but then if you're not honest,
Right.
that is the challenge.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
And, you know, it happens. I mean, you know, to the best of us, when I say the best of us, you know, in premarital counseling, Doc, I'm sure, you know, there are areas that we would cover, and only to find out sometime later, maybe after marriage, that some person wasn't honest in their disclosures, you know. And so, you know, we do the best that we can, but as a person who is getting married, Pastor, I think I just have to say to people, you know, you have to be on your P's and Q's. Don't take anything for granted. Something doesn't sit right with you. Something isn't settled in your mind. You know, there's a certain behavior that you're observing with your spouse that doesn't kind of add up. You know, don't ignore it. You know, be you know, as vigilant as you can be as you attempt to develop this relationship.
I can't overemphasize the importance of honesty. And because we're talking about sins, now we were talking about past behaviors.
Yes.
But so let's get into the present now. You are married, you and your spouse are having a fairly good relationship. But then you discover, or you're suspicious of something, and you ask your spouse. You realize that, you know, something doesn't sound so right here. Or maybe you got home one day, and you realize the house is in darkness. The electricity has been disconnected. And you know, but my spouse says they pay the bill every month.
Every month, right.
You know, only to discover that is not true.
Yep.
How do you come clean and say to your spouse, listen, I was in a little spot of bother and I used the money to do something.
Right.
You know, maybe your mother called you. These are
Real-life situations.
Yes. And you use the money that was designated for this particular purpose with the promise that she was going to give you back at such and such a time, and it didn't come back. And because you didn't tell your spouse, you lent your mother some money, you find it difficult now to come and say, hey, listen, you know, we have a challenge because the bill is outstanding. We're saying it's always good to be upfront.
Right.
You know, or maybe somebody asks you for a favor. And you have a spirit of compassion to help this person. But you think, you know, if I tell my spouse I'm going to give this person $500, I'm going to lend them my spouse is going to say, no way. And so you go ahead and do it without telling your spouse, intending to put back or to cover up. It's always better to be honest.
Always better to be honest. And, you know, again, honesty is the best policy. You know, it really helps to avoid the kinds of what we might call blow-ups, escalations, because now that the person finds out after the fact, you know, the person is going to be upset, more likely angry, depending on, you know, the personality, and it can escalate to something worse and jeopardize, you know, much more in terms of the relationship. So it's good to be upfront. The truth is also, Doc, that, you know, you're going to have to deal with it at some time. And I think it's better to deal with it on your own terms, you know, where you can give the information, where you can share the information, rather than you coming home one day, you know, your spouse is sitting down, looking a little, and you're like, you know, what's up? You know, what happened? And then she begins to unload, or he begins to unload, you know, and you think, oh my goodness, you know. So it's really good to be able to do that on your own terms, to craft and set the tone so that you can share, even though it's difficult information to share, you can be a part of that process.
Because, you know, Doc, the matter of not being honest has some attachments. In order to cover up one sin or one failure to self-disclose, you find yourself having to do something else. I remember I had an experience once where I encountered this gentleman, and he was dishonest. He was pretending to be who was not, you know. And he sold himself as this individual who had accomplished so much, right? And after all of that, he discovered, because he had no idea that I was going to be in the same territory with him. And then he discovered that I was going to be there. And so now he had to make some excuses. And as it turned out, Doc, I ended up teaching a class that he was a part of. So how could this guy who has accomplished so much, who had already covered this area with flying colors, not end up, and so you find him making excuses and saying, oh, I'm going to retake this course because it's not a good path that you want to be, especially with your spouse.
Absolutely not. You want to be, in order for your relationship to function well, you want to be honest. You want to be upfront. You want to avoid those types of pitfalls that can, of course, create havoc and challenge for your relationship.
Sometimes we fail.
And that's human. It's a part of the human experience. Failure is a part of the human experience.
I'm going to start light, Doc, because you told your spouse, we're having cricket tonight, and so on, and your spouse, for whatever reason, who normally comes and supports and cheers you on, couldn't come, but you went into bed and you made a duck, right?
Right.
And you go home and your spouse says, how was it? And you say, it was great, man.
Right.
You made any runs? Yeah, man, I held the innings together. I did great. Because you're not willing to say that you failed.
Right.
Again, honesty says you're going to come clean.
Come clean.
That's right.
Yeah. And I like this final one as we look at it, Doc. We move from sex, sins, failure to needs and vulnerabilities. What you need as an individual, or the things that cause you to be fearful or afraid, or the things that you don't do very well. Your ability to speak about your vulnerabilities, your ability to speak about what you need as an individual, as a husband, what I need from my spouse, what I need from my wife, or my fears, the things that I'm afraid of, my vulnerabilities, the things that I have a bit of a challenge talking about because it makes me feel, maybe a little less than. It messes with my self-esteem. Sometimes we have a difficulty being honest with those things. We have a difficulty saying what we need. We have a difficulty disclosing our fears. For me personally, and this is not a hidden one, so I can tell the world, but I have a challenge with heights. Okay, and my wife is fully aware of this. So back in the day, years ago, when we were out, and she was desirous of going to look out from a spot that was very, very high. And I had to express to her, look, I am not very comfortable with this, And it was a vulnerability that I've had to share with her. And well, as I said, it's common knowledge now. But the ability to be able to say that you have a fear, or you're afraid, or you don't like something, it makes you uncomfortable. For some people, it's a sign of weakness.
And I kind of wanted to go back there because I was thinking about a different example, but I think you used a really good one. Let's assume you were dishonest, and you said to your spouse, "Oh, that's easy for me to do, man. I can do that." And you are at this place this time when something important needed to be retrieved from a particular point that was really, really high.
Yeah.
And you're there maybe at a picnic or something, and your wife looks because you told them that you could conquer that.
Anything,
and somebody needs to go for it, and she says, "Oh, my honey will go for that, man. That's easy. He can take care of that." Imagine now, you have been dishonest, and you have put yourself in a real difficult position because now you start to sweat. How am I going to make this? And that could be very embarrassing.
Very embarrassing, And if you had been honest up front, she would never have put you in that position.
Exactly.
Because she knows exactly that that's not your cup of tea. So, rather than, hiding those vulnerabilities, it's important to be able to share them, particularly with your spouse. Because at some point in time, she will be able to stand up and protect you. When everybody else is saying, hey, let him go. She may just come and hug you up and say, I don't want my spouse up there.
That's
she protects you. You understand what I'm saying? So, that ability to be honest in terms of needs and vulnerability is very important.
It is. And it helps the marriage because while we're talking about specific situations, Doc, there is this dimension of the comfort of knowing that I am in love with a real person.
Yes.
If I don't know you deep down, I can't really love you as I should.
Can't connect, yes.
And so when you are open, when you are vulnerable, because your spouse needs to see inside of you. And, I go back to this intimacy, intimacy.
Yeah.
When your spouse can peep deep into your soul, in your inner being, then your spouse know that you are a real person. And we need to have real persons in our lives. We need to be real to one another. If you don't know how your spouse, there's some people who are so unemotional. I mean, yeah, you do meet people who are unemotional. But when a person is completely unemotional, you don't know whether they are happy, whether they're sad, whether they are angry, whether they're upset. It's difficult to read them. You don't know how to play the cards, and that can be a challenge. And if your spouse has to live with that, that becomes very stressful.
But I want to say that, some persons may be generally unemotional, but I think they need to learn, particularly with their spouses, how to express themselves for the benefit of the relationship. You spoke about intimacy, and we've shared over and over again that the ability of a person to share their needs, their vulnerabilities, and what's going on inside of them is extremely important in the building of that type of closeness, because it's difficult to get close to a person that you cannot see. It's difficult to get close to a person that, is unable to express when they're unhappy. They look the same all the time. Whether you do something great or do something not so nice, there's no expression, no display of emotion. That creates quite a bit of discomfort and really has the potential to hamper a relationship. I think, it's something that a person must learn to do in the context of their marriage.
Very wide counsel. Again, we're the friends. We are suggesting here that being able to express your true self is important. Be honest. Your spouse, how are you feeling today, honey? Share. I've had a bad day at work. Right. Things didn't go well. Right. Then your spouse can minister to you.
Absolutely.
But it looks like we are winding up right now. It is an important discussion. There are a few more things we want to say on honesty before we move on. We're going to kind of wrap it up next week. We want to encourage you to make every opportunity to join us next week, because it gets even more interesting, though.
Yes, it does.
I was really anxious. I almost wanted to forego the things we shared today because I want to get to some other things.
Yeah.
But we just want to encourage you to keep listening, keep tuning in, and remember to tell a friend about Marriage Encounter. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, it is marriageencounter@slcadventist.org. We are waiting to hear from you. May God bless you. May you keep faithful and trusting in God. So that's all the time we have for today. Until next week, same time, may God's richest blessings be yours.